What makes a game challenging? More to the point, what separates challenge from difficulty? Sorry, I know this is a weird opening tangent to go on, but after playing through some 10 odd hours of Gorky 17, this was ultimately the question I was left asking myself, for one very particular reason. In my opinion, Gorky 17 is not a challenge. It's difficult. I'd go so far as to say in some places it openly cheats. Now, does this mean that Gorky 17 is a bad game? No, not necessarily. There are a lot of games I can mention that pull the occasional dick move to catch the player out, but they're often set up as a means to change up the gameplay, or they're traps laid down to introduce the player to a whole new mechanic. They have a purpose that ultimately benefits the player and the game. As I'm about to go on and rant about for a good 6 odd pages, Gorky 17 misses the fundamental point of this. It creates obstacles with no purpose, without proper understanding of what those hurdles are meant to achieve, and actually ends up creating a weaker experience because of it. Is it bad? Not because of this specifically, but it is a symptom of the major issue. I know that quite a lot of people rather like this game, and I'm not here to piss in their metaphorical cornflakes, but be warned, this review is going to give it a bit of a kicking. I'll be praising it in places, but, well, we all know how damning faint praise can be, can't we? If you're familiar with Eurojank, and if you follow my channel for any length of time, you're probably aware that I very much am, you're almost certainly going to recognise a few hallmarks here. The graphics are that very charming mix of extremely low budget, but with a certain amount of flair that actually comes all the way back around into genuinely impressive. Despite the resolution being in the 3-digit range, and most of the player models not being much better, there's a very distinct visual style and a very measured approach to map design that's quite visually pleasing. Navigation is never particularly difficult, even with a lot happening on the screen, and each location has its own palette and distinct feel that, coupled with some impressive scoring and voice work, manages to sell the low-res look rather than detract from it. Even the models, which are not exactly complex, are smoothly animated and all carry a distinct profile and design. Once you compare them to the original concept art, it's clear that someone worked their arse off to boil down these designs without losing the essential look. The voice acting is also really quite good. I mean, if we ignore the dialogue itself, which is notoriously the one place where many games of this sort tend to fall flat on their face. I think a lot of credit in this case has to go to the cast, which includes Michael Shapiro, Kathy Levin, both Half-Life alumni as G-Man, Barney and the voice of the HEV suit respectively, as well as Stefan motherfucking Waite. Like, we have got some A-list voice acting talent in a Polish fucking turn-based strategy game. It's such an absolute out-of-nowhere turn. Now, I'm not entirely sure who anyone voiced, given that the credits don't state who played who, but this is some premium fucking voice talent across the board. Given that Shapiro, Levin and Waite all feature on Monolith projects, I'll take it that we have the publisher to thank for this, because Monolith did publish the North American release. So, thanks? This is a lot of effort to put on a game like this, but when the stars align, they align, don't question it. The real meat of the gameplay itself, the combat and connective tissue of exploration between encounters, is again robust, but suffers from being either too straightforward or playing with unpolished mechanics. While the layout and the function of the grid and turn-based combat has quite a few layers to it, flanking, counterattacks and status effects, all able to be employed by your party, they often feel like they didn't go through enough testing and balancing, if at all. Flanking works fine, but few enemies seem to really exploit that against you, nor do much to prevent being flanked themselves. Counterattacks are great for melee, but near worthless for anyone you intend to use ranged weaponry, as your frontline fighters will often be the only ones soaking the damage. The status effects, which I will be bitching about liberally later on, are only as effective as the game allows them to be, with early game enemies being just as susceptible to them as you are, before dropping the hammer and effectively rendering a lot of the same effects worthless. Apart from the stun mechanic, which is hilariously broken, but again, I'll come to that later. Overall, Gorky 17 is pretty satisfying to play if you're enjoying it on a casual level. If you're happy to play around the flaws in the game's design and appreciate the experience, then yeah, this is worth a go. Grab it on the cheap and chip away at it casually, and I don't think you'll be disappointed. But if you're looking for complex strategy and balanced gameplay, you might want to look elsewhere. Okay, are the spoiler people gone? Cool! So, I'm going to go back to that original ramble about the difference between challenge and difficulty. This is where I finally get to take the belt off and let rip. Now, to preface this, I'm not exactly mad at the game, at least not in hindsight, because it's clear that a good amount of thought and effort went into making it. As I said earlier, there's a lot to praise about the presentation of the game and its use of limited assets to great effect, but when we look past the Narm charm and take Gorky 17 on its merits as an experience, as a challenge, if you will, the issues start piling up. I might as well start with the biggest offender. Gorky 17 will fuck you over. Not by some accident or bug or lack of balance, but intentionally by design. At several points throughout the story, the game killed off some of my characters, stole my equipment, and began fielding enemies that rendered much of the equipment I did still have effectively useless. Most of these moments are also directly tied to plot progression, so you can't avoid them, merely account for their arrival, which leads me to one particular question. When this happens, why don't I just load an old save and plan around it? Gorky 17 does have, as you might expect, the ability to save. Throughout the LP I saved in separate slots in order to give myself some failsafes in case a file corrupted, although, credit to the game, it never crashed. When the game pulled a fast one, say in an early example when Joan, our medic, gets killed off in a cutscene, I did pause to wonder if the designers had intended for me to simply shrug, load an old save and play back through. I mean, that's what I could have done. Now that I knew when and where certain characters were going to get killed off, I could ensure that on the screen beforehand, I could take all their gear and march them off to their death without having to worry about losing anything important. Joan's actually a really good example of this, so I'll drill down into this a little bit more. When you find Joan, who's having a bit of a moment in the sewers, you discover that she has a bonus to healing. Thus, you'll probably end up giving her a good portion of your healing items to get the most benefit from them. Given how scarce resources often are, you can only find them in crates scattered throughout the map, this would make the most sense. So if you'd done this, Joan's sudden and quite fucking cheap death, coupled with the fact that despite her body having not even gone cold yet, nobody seems inclined to loot her body for the half-dozen first aid kits we'd given her, you might consider this to be a cheap shot by the game. Either it presumes you're willing to soldier on without them, which I did out of some masochistic streak, or it's expecting you to sigh, load your previous save, and undo the fuckery the game just pulled. It's either failing to remember how its own save system works, or it's willfully forcing you to backtrack and tack on another 30 plus minutes of recycled gameplay. Incompetence or malice? The choice is yours. Given that the game ends up repeating this little trick more than a few times, I'm liable to believe it's the latter, given how none of these events are telegraphed in the slightest. We lose one guy early on who isn't much of a problem unless you made the mistake of giving him your only taser. He was skittish and a bit fucky anyway, so it's not a big deal. It's when the game decides to tear away interesting and mechanically useful characters that I really began to spit chips. As I just mentioned, losing Joan is a big hit to the unprepared player given her role as the team medic. Later on, you run into a mutant called Medusa who rolls with a completely new set of abilities at the cost of not being able to use regular weapons. His attacks can stun enemies and arc across tiles. It's cool and it's interesting and it's a change of pace from the grind I've been getting used to. Then you walk across the wrong bit of roof and trigger a cutscene where he goes crazy and you've got to put him down. You technically haven't even left the building you found this fucker in and the game snatches him away. I struggle to picture the moment where someone developing this game looked at the cool, unique character they'd made and thought to themselves, but we can't let the player have too much fun. Sorry, that was probably a bit offensive, but fuck it, I've recorded it now. It's going in. What's more impressive is that all of this is optional. You don't have to walk that way, meaning you can skip the trigger and keep Medusa with you for a bit longer. The game still forces you to abandon all your new allies at the beginning of the last act because fuck you, that's why. It's such a strange decision. I'm still, even now, not completely sure if the game was intended to be this way, or if this is just a byproduct of ambitious design, meeting limited time and skill. The best way to judge this is most likely going to come down to your feelings about the combat in Gorky 17, which is a fascinating car crash of good ideas being smashed into one another until there's nothing but a semi-functional mess. While I'll imagine a good amount of people who enjoy the turn-based squad genre will be familiar with movement across a grid and use of cover, Gorky 17 makes a few additions to these already fairly robust mechanics that just fuck them up. All of your weapons also apply to the same grid you move through, so some of them fire in the 4 cardinal directions, others can also fire diagonally. Explosives can hit a 9-tile square at a distance, and certain weapons can hose down a T-shaped area with fire. On paper, I can see how this makes sense. It's giving each weapon a specific use, so you'll be frequently switching up your gear to deal with whatever situation you're in. In practice, not being able to hit a monster because you're 1 tile out of alignment and you can't point your pistol in anything less than 90-degree increments, feels like you're being intentionally hobbled. It's something you'll eventually learn to work around, but there's no reward for mastery. It's just piling on another complication you've got to deal with in order to actually play the game. Cover, which in itself is pretty rare in game, is also more of a burden than a benefit. Few enemies have actual proper ranged attacks, with most of them defaulting to the bum rush style of engagement, so spending a turn moving into a defensible position is really just wasting time. Coupled that with the fact that you can't shoot over cover, you can't actually attack over anything unless you've got a thrown weapon, and you've got a system that's better suited for upfront attrition over genuine tactics. Speaking of standing there and booting the fuck out of the enemy, let's talk about the status effect system in the game uses and how absolutely goddamn broken it is. Let's be upfront. You can stun lock most of the enemies in this game. Even the final boss. The game is pretty generous in doling out gear that can stun most enemies for a few rounds, so if you have 2 tasers or enough trank darts and stun grenades, you can reduce a 400 HP monster into a big, fleshy punching bag. Now, not all enemies are susceptible to this. Most of the enemies you encounter from the mid-game onwards begin to boast outright immunity to a good amount of the status effects you can dish out, as well as sporting heavier armour to make your regular attacks less effective. This means, as it did with me, you'll bust out one of your rechargeable crowd control weapons, or better yet, one of the weapons with extremely limited ammo, only to discover the enemy you targeted tanks it without a scratch. Now, credit to the game, it will then put a little icon beside that enemy to remind you that it's immune to that kind of attack, but by that point the damage has, or in this case hasn't, been done. As the game goes on, the enemies get tougher, their armour gets heavier, and the list of immunities they have gets even longer. I can appreciate that this was most likely the developers trying to make the end game more challenging, but in execution all it does is slow the pace right down to a crawl where you either figure out the way to exploit the enemy in the first round, or spend 20 minutes slowly grinding them down. And yet, I don't hate it. Once you figure out the rules that the game's playing by, the combat isn't all that bad. It took me a while to figure it out, but this game feels quite a lot like the playtests I've taken part in for role-playing and tabletop games. They often have a nice core idea with some new and interesting ideas, but there's usually a few rough edges or redundant rules that need pruning, and which is normally what playtesting is there to do. I think Rufus described the game best as a game made by a small group of people who really liked it, who didn't think about who else might try it. Gorky 17's gameplay feels very much like something made in a bubble, where everyone understood it from the ground up, but by being so accustomed to how it does things, it forgot that everyone coming into the game fresh is going to have a much harder time getting acclimatized to its rules. It's janky, and it may not be the most user-friendly system in the world, but for all its faults, it tried something new and interesting, and hell, it got a sequel and a prequel, so maybe this was more fun than I gave it credit for. Okay, now we finish with the fun stuff. Time for the absolute arsewater. The plot. For much of the game, the plot is pretty simplistic, but it's functional. Russia bombs the fuck out of an old military installation, and now NATO is trying to figure out what the hell happened. You're going in to rescue the first team, and immediately things are clearly not what they seem. We fight mutants, learning that they were the original inhabitants of the city, and begin to piece together the events that led up to the bombing. So far, so good. As the team progresses, we start to pick apart the events behind the whole sordid affair, and while it's nothing groundbreaking, it's cohesive enough that I could hand-wave it as something to make the game happen. For every Steven Spielberg forging fine and complex storytelling, although not recently, there's a Roger Corman out there bashing their Duplo blocks of dialogue together to get to the next fun monster scene. It's nothing to be ashamed of. Vivisector is completely silly from the end to end, and I love it to bits. But Gorky 17 isn't a Spielberg, and despite everything, I can't really say it's a Corman either, despite having so much going for it. No. This is an M. Night Shyamalan. Not Sixth Sense Shyamalan, not Unbreakable Shyamalan. This is Lady in the Water. This is The Happening. This is... okay, it's not as bad as Avatar. The game takes a perfectly functional idea for a story, and then comes in at the 11th hour with a twist that serves absolutely no purpose whatsoever. The game upends a truckload of exposition delivered by a character who not only just tried to kill us, but we then took down, then defended from the actual bad guy who was there all along. There's shit about teleporting the gene out of human DNA because it's slowly killing off humanity, and apparently we've only got a generation left before we all die and the governments are covering it up. Why did it have to be here? You could cut right after the last boss, and I'd have honestly had a higher opinion of the game for just being a weird, janky but earnest creature feature. Slapping this bombastic pseudoscience crap on the tail end just doesn't make anything we've seen in the game before make any more sense. When it comes to Eurojank games, very frequently the story is not necessarily the key selling point, but it can still be executed well, escalating naturally throughout the plot, even if the dialogue is maybe not on point, but leading to an ultimately satisfying climax or conclusion, or maybe even, I did praise Vivisector, but a twist which is so bizarre or so avant-garde that it sort of just upends the table and walks away. Gorky 17 tries to have its cake and eat it by trying to create a reveal and then explain it in such punishing detail that it loses all effect as a twist. Again, it's not enough to make me hate the game, it just feels like this is something that could have been left on the cutting room floor and actually benefited the game. But anyway, that's my thoughts on Gorky 17. I have taken so many attempts to try and review this bloody game, and every single time I've cocked it up. This has been a bit of improv, a bit of scripting. I'm trying to figure out precisely how this will work in later reviews, but for the moment, fuck it. Hopefully this has been fairly informative. Thank you very much for listening to me ramble about this game. Thank you very much for watching me play through this game, and hopefully I will come back with something, well, we'll see. I've got some ideas. But anyway, thank you very much for listening to this, and goodbye.